This is an introduction to Christian morality with Father Matt Lattack. The picture on screen is from the Mount of Temptation, traditionally the mountain where Jesus was tempted by the devil. As you can see, the stairs go back and forth around the mountain, forcing you to look at where you've come from and where you're going. In many ways, this is the central question of Christian morality. Where have I come from? On my journey through life marked with successes, failures, and triumphs, where am I going? What is my destination? What am I made for? The Catechism of the Catholic Church answers that question for us. It tells us that by becoming a part of the Church via our baptisms, we are made God's children, His beloved daughters and sons. We are to approach life with this dignity in mind, moving with God's grace to become full partakers in God's divine life. Since God is full, unconditional love, that means our lives must become ones filled with full, unconditional love. This is what we're made for, to love as God loves, in all of our relationships. We may seem overwhelmed with this, but the thing of it is we don't do it alone. God is always there to help us. Oftentimes, God helps us through other people. Our families and friends help us on our journey towards heaven. It is in these central relationships that we are to first learn what it is to give love, to receive love, to sacrifice, to forgive, to be forgiven. It is in our home life that we first learn the path to holiness. Your home is not just where you sleep with your stuff around you. It is the place where you can develop your holiness, your life with God, your ability to show love. God also gives us the sacraments to help us on our journeys. They bring us into contact with God's mysteries, feed us, heal us, and enliven our lives with vocations or callings, which draw us further into love. The sacraments pull us out of the rhythm of the world and move us into God's rhythm. As we move through life, we need to be aware of God. It is important to be constantly in contact with God through prayer. We need to pray to God, learn about God, come to know Him for who He is, through the Scriptures, through the sacraments, through our families, friends, and loved ones. We come to know who He is in our lives. That way we can discover what God wants for us, love as Christ loves, and be transformed by the Spirit. This is not God tricking us, God punishing us, or God depriving us of anything. Doing good is good in the truest sense. It would lead us to our truest happiness, our truest joy. This joy the Catechism calls Beatitude. It is sharing in God's joy, God's blessedness. Matthew's Gospel lists 8 of them. 8 Beatitudes, 8 ways of being blessed. We'll get into those Beatitudes in a little bit. For now, we acknowledge that this happiness is what we want out of life. Every human being wants to be happy. It's as true as it is obvious, but sadly, so often we look for that happiness in the wrong things, in money, pleasure, power, fame, etc. When we live the blessed life, we move towards true happiness, towards what our deepest desire truly is. Ultimately, this happiness is supernatural. It moves beyond anything most of us have ever experienced, beyond what we could do on our own. God freely gives each of us individually and the Church collectively the ability to know who we are and to receive joyfully this beautiful life with Him. The image on the screen is of a stained glass window, in particular a rose window, because of it's called that because of its shape, and it has Christ at the center. If you think about stained glass windows, they're essentially little pieces of glass, each with their own colors, shapes, features, etc., and they come together to form an image, in this case with Christ centering and ordering that image. What makes stained glass beautiful, enhancing its natural features, is the light that comes in from outside of it and shines through it, and it gives it all this glow and brilliance and beauty. It takes what's naturally there and makes it all the better, making it what it was meant to be, this beautiful cosmic image, shining with a light that's not its own. That's a little bit of what Beatitude is like. Beatitude is us individually taking our gifts and making them a part of a greater whole, and shining with a light that is not our own, shining with God's light and knowing His joy. Because Beatitude is supernatural, it isn't something we get or earn on our own. God chooses to give it to us. Only God can fulfill this desire. But it does come with a catch. We have to choose to participate with it or not, choose to follow God or not. The Ten Commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, etc. all prod us with this invitation. They all tell us to move away from whatever sinful activity we find ourselves tempted by and begin to move toward what God wants us to do by His grace. The statue is from Assisi and depicts St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis was confronted with this invitation. He was born into a rich merchant family. He wanted to be a knight, but he had an intense experience of God one day in a church, and it changed everything in his life profoundly. Suddenly he wanted to live the gospel in a true, deep way. He gave away his possessions, began to live a life dedicated to God and the poor, and he discovered beatitude. Earlier I alluded to 8 Beatitudes listed in the Gospel of Matthew. Here they are on the screen now. You may notice there's a seeming contradiction between what is depicted and what we typically think of as blessedness or happiness. And you're right. Poverty, mourning, suffering, these don't look like happiness as we've come to expect it. God shifts our expectations. He knows that what the world offers us isn't good. It's ultimately unsatisfying. And He moves us to see life as He sees it. The Beatitudes come to us as a story of Jesus gathering this large crowd. They come from all over to hear what He has to say. They're longing to know something different. We are told they come to Jesus because He teaches them with authority, in a way completely different from the scribes and Pharisees, the experts of the age. He's teaching them something new. He's teaching them with authority to be like Himself. Pope Benedict, in his book Jesus of Nazareth, has this great quote. Anyone who reads Matthew's text attentively will realize that the Beatitudes present a sort of veiled interior biography of Jesus, a kind of portrait of His figure. He who has no place to lay his head is truly poor. He who can say, "Come to me, for I am meek and lowly in heart," is truly meek. He is the one who is pure of heart and so unceasingly beholds God. He is the peacemaker. He is the one who suffers for God's sake. The Beatitudes display the mystery of Christ Himself, and they call us into communion with Him. But precisely because of their hidden Christological character, Beatitudes are also a roadmap for the Church, which recognizes in them the model of what she herself should be. God invites us to live that He already has. God has already lived out each of the Beatitudes, and Jesus did this in His human nature. He became weak that we might see how to become strong. Imagine a coach showing you how to shoot a basket by walking you through the motions as they themselves shoot. That's what Jesus did. We are now going to go through the Beatitudes, but we're going to look at them in pairs. We'll start with the first and the third Beatitude. The first one talks about poverty. We often think about how nice it would be to be wealthy, to have a lot, to possess a lot of things, cool jets, swimming pools, infinite video games, etc. This Beatitude reminds us of 2 things. 1, God is closest to the downtrodden. If God has favorites, then He loves the underdog. He loves the person that everyone else forgets. It's in His compassion that He comes to them, and He loves them. Secondly, it reminds us that God is generous, and being generous is likewise the thing that will make us happy. Pope Benedict, in the quote on the screen, talks about St. Therese of Lisieux and her attitude about having empty hands. The poor come with empty hands, not with hands that grasp and clutch, but with hands that are open and give, and thus are ready to receive from God's bountiful goodness. It's in giving that we learn to be open, that we're ready to receive. It's in giving that we can be filled with God's Spirit, filled with God's love. Let's turn now to the third Beatitude. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. We often think, wouldn't it be great if everybody had to listen to me? If I could have my own way and I could plan how my life and my world will be, then it would be perfect. And Jesus goes the opposite way. He shows us His kingship rooted in meekness. As Pope Benedict and the Gospels point out, He fulfills His kingship by being meek and humble. He enters it not by chariots, but He breaks chariots. He enters peacefully, not with power, but with invitation. He takes the servant's role and says, "Come, follow after me." He invites you to follow after Him. He doesn't dominate you or enslave you. He says, "No, come, join me." And what is Jesus inviting us to but to become obedient to the Father? His will is not his own. His desire is not to do whatever he wants, but it's to do the will of the Father. His will is obedience to God. So must our wills become. We must become obedient to God. As I'm saying all this, it's mostly from Pope Benedict, who also gives us an interesting note about the line about the earth. In the Old Testament, the place of obedience was Israel itself. There was a covenant between God and his people, specific to the land of Israel. That was the place where God was to be obeyed, the realm where God's will was done. Now, Jesus has extended that realm of meekness, the realm of obedience, to the ends of the earth, you and to I, to make our homes, our places, into realms of meekness, into realms of doing God's will. Of all the Beatitudes, the second probably seems like the most contradictory. Where is their blessing in mourning? The Christian type of mourning is one with hope. The mourner will be comforted. But at the same time, the mourner is someone who sees the issues of the world, the evils of the world, and refuses to go along with them. The Christian mourner is one whose journey is with those who suffer. They open their hearts. And again, quoting Pope Benedict, they are the ones who do not harden their hearts to the pain and need of others. They do not give evil entry into their souls, but suffer under its power, and so acknowledge the truth of God. They are the ones who open the windows of the world to let light in. The Christian mourner is the one who says, this is what true goodness is. They say, this is what the good thing should be. This is the way the world should look like. And they mourn that it doesn't look like that. They are people who suffer with others, and at the same time, they hope that things will be better. Look at the two people on the screen, unquestionably acknowledged by Christians everywhere as the two holiest human beings ever. They both have their hearts open to the pain of others. Jesus suffers with and for us sinners. Mary suffers with her Son. And they both trust that this cross will not be the end of the story. Our crosses will not be the end of the story. There will be a resurrection. Let us turn now to the seventh Beatitude. In it we see the linking of peace with our relationship with God. It links peace with our identity as God's sons and daughters. You may be thinking, shouldn't peace be started with my relationship to others? But it tells us, no, start with that inmost relationship. It tells us that until my interior life is settled, until I have myself interiorly grounded in God, then I can't have peace with you. If I am unsettled, if I have needs and wants, and I have this raging sea within me, then I can't have peace with you. So it says, settle yourself as God's sons and daughters and become a person of peace. That shalom, that peace that God wishes on the world, comes from acknowledging our relationship with God. Peace comes when we ground ourselves in the God who is love. And then grounded in love, we move towards loving our neighbor. We move towards forgiving our neighbor. We move towards sharing our goods with our neighbor, out of love for them. That is where peace begins. Both the fourth and eighth Beatitude deal with righteousness. The fourth, it is about discovering righteousness. With the last, it is about holding on to what you have found. The first thing that you need to understand is that, biblically speaking, righteousness is understood as faith. Think of Abraham, already an old man, comfortably set up, going off righteously to follow God. Or Moses, though he is aware of his own shortcomings, doing the same thing and leading an entire people to freedom. Then there's David facing down Goliath. There's Elijah alone facing down the assembled prophets of Baal. Biblical righteousness is founded in trusting God to lead you where you need to go. It's in trusting the God who is love. It's about trusting that this love, who is God, is the ultimate truth that I seek. The second thing that you need to understand is that despite their talks of suffering and hunger and thirst, these are two incredibly hopeful Beatitudes. Remember, in Matthew's Gospel later on, Jesus says, let those who are weary come to him. In John's Gospel, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never hunger, and whoever believes in me will never thirst. The depth of Christ and his love for us can never be exhausted. The mystery of God can never be exhausted. If you're hungry, if you're thirsty for truth, you'll find it in God. With the other beatitude, we see that holding on to our faith, no matter what, we will win. As Pope Benedict points out, there will always be opposition to this faith. In every age, every era of humanity, there's going to be opposition. There's always going to be a struggle. But in persevering and holding on to this faith, there's great joy, and we may lose a battle. We may end up even losing our lives. But God conquers all things, including death itself, and we will know the joy of eternal happiness with God. Persevering in faith means that we are guaranteed joy in God's kingdom. The final two Beatitudes we'll talk about both have to do with relationship. They both have to do with coming to see God at work in your life, and then from that love, moving to love of neighbor. With regards to Blessed are the Merciful, Pope Benedict puts it in the context of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And we see that the tax collector is a person of mercy who becomes merciful because he himself knows that he needs mercy. He asks for mercy from God, and this asking for mercy from God helps him to recognize his need to be merciful towards others. As he puts it, this sinner, this tax collector, knows that he needs mercy, and so he learns from God's mercy to become merciful himself, and thereby becomes like God. He draws life from being in relationship, from receiving all as gift. He will always need the gift of goodness, of forgiveness, but in receiving it, he will always learn to pass on that gift to others. The grace for which he prays does not dispense him from ethics. It is what makes him truly capable of doing good in the first place. He needs God, and because he recognizes that, he begins, through God's goodness, to become good himself. Ethics is not denied, it is freed from the constraints of moralism, set in the context of a relationship of love, of relationship to God. What we see here is that instead of just being rules that one follows, morality then becomes something about love. It becomes something about mercy. It becomes something of forgiveness. It becomes something of journeying in another person's shoes and saying, I too know what it's like to need help. I too know what it's like to need goodness. I too know what it's like to need somebody to be merciful to me. Purity of heart is about ordering and organizing our hearts around one central object. Rather than having different parts of ourselves going after this and that, it says, no, I want to focus on the central thing, the essential thing, which is love itself. If Blessed are the Merciful is about being forgiven and becoming forgiving, then purity of heart is about conversion. So somebody who is converted, and how they love God, and then that love transforms them. Having been transformed, I am then free to love everyone else, because when my creativity, my intellect, my sexuality, everything that makes me who I am is centered on love, then I move out of that. I don't move from sin, I don't move from my desires, my wants, I move from what's best for you, for me. And suddenly I discover the face of God in every aspect of my life. Having said all of this, now that we know that this is what we're made for, the trick is to live it out. The challenge is to examine our lives and see, am I living the Beatitudes? Am I doing what God wants for me?